Chapter 18. As Halt had predicted, their progress became even slower when they reached the dense wood they had sighted on the horizon. Here the trees grew in thick, unordered confusion on either side of the narrow path. As Horace walked through them, the changing angles from which he viewed the moss-covered ranks of tree trunks seemed to create a sensation of movement in the shadows, so that he was constantly stopping to look again, making sure that he hadn't just seen something moving. They were assisted by the 2 ranger horses, of course. Tug and Abelard were both trained to warn their masters if they sensed the presence of strangers, but even their abilities depended on the direction of the wind. If someone were downwind, his scent wouldn't be carried to them. They proceeded in a series of short rushes. First, Will would go forward 10 or 20 meters while Halt stood, bow ready, until Will gained the cover of a tree trunk. Then Will would scan the forest while Halt moved forward and went past him to another point 20 meters farther along. Then they would repeat the process, leapfrogging each other, one watching while another went forward. Frequently they stopped to let the horses test the air for any out-of-place sounds or scents from the trees around them. Horace brought up the rear. He had his shield slung over his back for protection. If he needed it in a hurry, he could quickly shrug it around onto his left arm. His sword was drawn. When he had first drawn the weapon, he had felt a little self-conscious, concerned that it might make him appear nervous. But Halt had nodded approvingly when he caught the gleam of the sharp blade in the dull light under the trees. "Nothing more useless than a sword you have left in your scabbard," he had said. Halt had also instructed him to turn suddenly from time to time and scan the path behind them, making sure there was no one about to strike at them from behind. "Don't do it at regular intervals," Halt had told them as they were about to enter the dim green world of the forest. "Anybody trailing us will recognize a regular pattern, and they'll match it and move more freely. Mix things up. Keep changing it." So now, from time to time, Horace would turn to scan the path, turn back, and then whip around again immediately. Halt had told them that this was the best way to catch a pursuer unaware. But each time he did it, there was nobody there. That did nothing to lessen the tension. He was only too aware that at any moment he could turn like this and there might be someone moving on the track behind them. He realized that his hand on his sword grip was damp with tension, and he wiped it carefully on his jacket. In a battle, Horace would face any enemy and any number of enemies without flinching. It was the uncertainty of the situation that unsettled him. The knowledge that, no matter how many times there had been nothing behind him, this could be the time when it all went wrong. He also felt extremely vulnerable in the company of Will and Halt. He watched them as they ghosted between the trees, their cloaks helping them blend into the gray and green shades of the forest, so that at times he had trouble seeing them clearly. He was wearing the cloak that Halt had given him, of course, but he knew that the skill of concealment depended on more than just the camouflage patterns of the cloak. It was a result of years of practice, of learning how to use the smallest amount of cover available, how to move swiftly without breaking twigs or rustling dead leaves underfoot, knowing when to move and when to stand utterly still, even though your nerves shrieked at you to dive into cover. Compared with the 2 almost silent shadows who accompanied him, he felt like a huge blundering draft horse, lurching and crashing through the trees and undergrowth. The grim thought occurred to him that any ambusher with half a brain would look for the easiest, most visible target for his first shot. And that would be him. Unconsciously, he wiped his damp hand on his jacket again. Up ahead, as Halt moved forward past him, Will glanced quickly back at his best friend, bringing up the rear. It was just an extra precaution, making sure that nobody was stalking Horace. The man in the center of the line, whether it was Halt or Will, had the responsibility for checking front, back, and sides as they progressed. He had been impressed by Horace's calmness. The young warrior hadn't been trained for this sort of shadowy, nerve-stretching maneuvering, yet he seemed to be cool and unflustered. Will, on the other hand, was surprised that neither of his friends could hear his heart hammering inside his rib cage. The tension beneath the trees was almost palpable. The expectation that a crossbow bolt could come ripping out of the shadowy forest, the concern that any slight inattention on his part could cost the lives of his friends, was close to unbearable. He shook his head angrily. That sort of thinking would lead to exactly the inattention he was worried about. "Clear your head. Clear your mind of all distractions," Halt had told him hundreds of times during the years they had been training together. "Become part of the situation. Don't think. Feel and sense what is around you." He took a deep breath and settled himself, emptying his mind of doubts and worries, focusing his attention and subconsciousness on his surroundings. After a few seconds, he began to hear the small sounds of the forest more clearly. A bird flashing from one tree to another, a squirrel chattering, a branch falling, Tug and Abelard stepping quietly beside him, their ears twitching as they listened for potential danger. Ahead of him, he could hear Halt's soft footfalls as he slipped forward, behind the louder sounds made by Horace and Kicker, no matter how much the tall youth tried to move quietly. This was the state of attention he needed. He had to hear the total spectrum of sound in the forest so that anything abnormal, any irregularity, would register immediately. For instance, if there were a shrill warning note from a squirrel's chattering call, it would indicate the presence of something, or someone, unwelcome in its territory. Most other small animals would respond to that sort of territorial declaration by moving back, he knew. A predator mightn't. A human predator definitely wouldn't. Halt had stopped, stepping over the cover of an ancient lichen-covered elm. Will surveyed the ground before him, picking his path so that he wouldn't move in a straight, predictable line, and then slid out from behind the tree that sheltered him and ghosted forward yet again. Tug and Abelard paced soft-footed behind him. Eventually the dim light began to go brighter, and the trees became more widely spaced. With each forward rush, Will and Halt could cover more territory until they had almost reached the edge of the forest. Will began to move forward, toward the open grass-covered heath, but Halt held up a hand and stopped him. "Look first," he said softly. "This could be just the place where they'd lie in wait, knowing we're lax once we're out of the forest." Will's mouth went dry as he realized that Halt was right. The sense of relief that he'd felt, the sudden lessening of tension, had almost led him into what would have been a fatal mistake. He crouched beside Halt, and together they studied the terrain ahead of them. Horace waited patiently, a few meters behind them, with the horses. "See anything?" Halt asked quietly. Will shook his head, his eyes still moving. "Neither do I," Halt agreed. "But that doesn't mean they're not there." He glanced up at the tree they sheltered behind. It was one of the taller trees, longer established than its neighbors. "Slip up the tree and take a look," he said, then added, "Stay on this side of the trunk while you do it." Will grinned at him. "I wasn't born yesterday." Halt raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not, but you could have died today if I'd let you go blundering out into the open a few minutes ago." There was no answer to that. Will looked up into the tree, selected the handholds and footholds he would use, and swarmed up into the branches. He'd always been an excellent climber, and it took only a few seconds for him to be 10 meters above the forest floor. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the land that lay before them. "No sign," he called softly. Halt grunted. "Can you find a good shooting position up there?" Will glanced around. A few meters above him was a wide branch that would give him a good position, with a clear view of the land ahead. He saw the sense of Halt's question. From an elevated position, he could see any ambusher's movement before they were in a position to shoot. "Give me a moment." He went higher up in the tree. Halt watched him, smiling at the ease with which he could climb. It's because he's not nervous, he realized. He feels at home up there and isn't afraid of falling. "Ready," Will called softly. He had an arrow ready on the string, and his eyes scanned from side to side. Halt rose from his kneeling position beside the tree and moved out into the open ground before them. He could make out the tracks of the outsiders once more. A heel print here, a patch of broken, flattened grass stems there, so faint that only an experienced tracker could see them. He moved out 10 meters, then 20, then 50. Unconsciously, he had moved in a crouch, his every muscle ready to dive into cover or loose a return shot at a moment's notice. Gradually, as he moved farther, he realized that the danger was past. He stood more erect, then stopping, he He signaled for Will and Horace to join him. The grass here was only knee-high. It provided nothing like the cover the shoulder-high gorse had. Anybody waiting in ambush here would be in more danger than their intended victims, Halt thought. They'd have to lie face down to conceal themselves, so they'd have to waste precious seconds rising to see their quarry and get ready for a shot. The Genevesians were too skilled to put themselves at such a disadvantage. They mounted and rode on, more relaxed now, but still scanning the ground carefully and still turning from time to time to check their rear. The grassland continued for several kilometers. Then they reached a ridge and looked down into a wide valley below them. "Now that's where we're going to have to be more careful," Halt said.